One of the staples of cultural criticism is the assumption that modern society provides ever more subtle means of controlling and manipulating individuals and making them usable for the notorious exploitation contexts. Digital technologies usually come off particularly badly. With their help, various feuilletons instruct their readers. The control and feedback society not only influences people's relationship to their bodies and their health, but also their emotions and even their unconscious. As proof, they point to jogging apps, activity trackers, running watches, and heart rate monitors, which, together with neuroenhancement, brain doping, and mindfulness coaching, form stages on the path to total self-optimization. As the pinnacle of self-optimization, even human sleep is being subjected to total usability by means of motion receptors, infrasound, interactive beds, pajama heat management, and digital dream control. Is that what we want? Asked Wirtschaftswoche back in February last year, proving that the most reliable way to criticize the context of exploitation is through their own advertising agencies. However, apart from the fact that no one is forced to be totally wired while running in the woods or taking a nap, the insinuation that people are now being deprived of their own sleep is particularly nonsensical. After all, their sleep has never belonged to them. In sleep, which is related to sex, illness, and old age, the first nature that is nowhere immediate, but nevertheless still present, asserts itself as resistance to its social conquest and transformation. All people must sleep. Those who do not sleep for too long will sooner or later endanger their health or even their lives. In this respect, sleep is a compulsion, something that cannot be completely controlled by the individual. On the other hand, people experience happy sleep as a temporary release from all compulsion, which is revoked morning after morning by the necessity of getting up on time, reflecting on time and functioning precisely. Both sides of sleep, its moment of compulsion and its moment of happiness, point to its remoteness from the subject. Being subject to sleep, as well as surrendering to it, expresses the fact that it comes over people, even where it is longed for or forced upon them by means of aids. It is a concrete, corporeal thing that cannot be dissolved into mere subjectivity. What is described as self-optimization is not an invention of neoliberalism, but refers to ancient techniques of civilization. Because people have to sleep in order to live, the metaphor of sleep as a little death denies this. They have always had to develop social techniques to induce sleep. However, because they are not allowed to sleep everywhere and at all times in order to live, they have also had to look for ways to control sleep and adapt it to the applicable time schedules. For centuries, quite brutal means were used for this purpose, which no one would seriously wish back. Friedrich Kittler recalled some of these in his book Dichter, Mutter, Kind, in which he describes the birth of romantic poetry from the voice of the mother. Up until the 18th century, children were sedated with morphine or wrapped in cloths all over their bodies like mummies to ensure that they slept reliably. Infants were literally tied to their beds with swaddling clothes. As Kittler shows, it was only with the increasingly exclusive importance of the mother-child relationship for child rearing as a result of the bourgeois division of labor that gentler forms of anesthesia developed, which, in addition to toys, crib pins, and related transitional objects, D.W. Winnicott, included above all the lullaby. In its sonority, its tendency towards hypnotic repetition, but especially in its connection to the mother's voice, it formed a bridge from the world of waking to the world of sleep, which gradually made more abrupt forms of transition superfluous. In his study, Kittler shows how this change in sleep technologies gave rise to a new imaginary world in which the mother was more strongly associated with the unconscious, dreams and drives than ever before. Also in the 18th century, another sound was invented that can be understood as a shrill countervoice to the lulling voice of the mother: the alarm clock. The previously developed alarm clocks had been just as brutal as the means of putting people to sleep. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci constructed an alarm clock in which a lever was activated by gradually filling a weighing pan with water at a pre-calculated time, which pulled the covers off the sleeping person and literally threw them out of bed. Other waking machines woke the sleepers by means of balls that crashed into bowls at a predetermined time or by means of air pressed into whistle valves. Such brute forms of waking reflected a way of life in which rest and leisure were reserved for the privileged classes. The prototype of the mechanical alarm clock that had prevailed since the 19th century, invented by the American clockmaker Levi Hutchins in 1787, had the disadvantage that it could only ring at 4 o'clock in the morning, because that was Hutchins' usual time for getting up. This is proof of the thesis developed by Norbert Elias in his book on time that the process of standardizing and universalizing time control in the history of civilization was longer and more complicated than is generally assumed. It took many centuries for social techniques to emerge, at least in Western societies, that made the transition from wakefulness to sleep and from sleep to wakefulness more or less pleasant for people. Strangely enough, very little research has been carried out into the significance of the voice, which has been so important for putting children to sleep since the 18th century, in the technologies of waking up. At least in the middle-class period, it can be assumed that children were not woken by the mechanical noise machines that roused their parents from sleep, but by speaking softly, touching their hands, or changing the light. With adults, on the other hand, the means of waking them up were probably always more brutal than those used to put them to sleep. The use of anesthetics, restraints to immobilize people is known almost exclusively from medicine and psychiatry. For cases of chronic insomnia, pharmaceutical drugs have been available since the 19th century, but although they are effective, they rarely leave the impression of a full night's sleep. This is where sleep apps and other digital sleep aids come in, promising sleep that is as individualized, sustainable, and therefore efficient in terms of work and psychotechnology as possible. Digital sleep technologies are not primarily aimed at people who have difficulty falling asleep or waking up. From the point of view of their propagandists, these are more the problems of precarious middle-class people who have missed the boat on their way into the post-industrial working world. They are aimed more at flexibilized startup zombies who want to perfect their sleep, which they naturally have well under control, and get the most out of their downtime in terms of relaxation. In this respect, the talk of self-optimization is true. It is misleading because it implies that people are being robbed of something of their innermost self through the sleep technological fine-tuning of their REM phases, that they are being expropriated, so to speak, by the sleep research carried out in the service of their superiors. In fact, what is threatening about the digitalization of sleep technologies is rather that sleep is to be deprived as far as possible of the character of being remote from the subject. It is to be transformed from a time in which people are, at best, happily not with themselves into a time that is completely subjugated to the subject. It is not that sleep is to be robbed from people, but that it is to be completely surrendered to them that should be frightening. It is no coincidence that the era that first gave sleep, especially that of children, special dignity was the era in which literature and the arts, but also everyday life, attached particular importance to the dream form as a corrective to bourgeois rationality. The fact that Freud's patients had to lie down on a couch as a gesture of transition to therapeutic conversation is reminiscent of this context. But even if the dreams of individuals and their sleep experiences are undoubtedly changed by the progressive intervention of sleep technologies in the unconscious itself, the drives, the somatic as a condition of the possibility of experience cannot be erased like superfluous anachronisms. It is more likely that people who are networked through sleep technology will increasingly perceive the resistant impulses of first nature as failures and disabilities that they are helpless and clueless in the face of, instead of experiencing them, as in the era of lullabies, as happiness against which waking life is to be measured. When I read Adorno's words for the first time, according to which no utopia is such without the abolition of death, it was like a completely consensual rereading and at the same time awakened a long-forgotten grief. It was only after some time that I realized that my first childishly intellectual confrontation with death and mortality had taken place in Tolkien's universe. Although I had previously slowly developed an understanding of loved ones dying through the deaths of relatives, I had long felt shame at my lack of grief, which was obviously expected, because the view that they would come back soon was still too strong. Even in fairy tales or other stories, death is often supposedly redemption in old age or just punishment. Above all, however, as a child you don't relate death to yourself for a long time. Even if you have accepted the finality of death at some point, you still think that you can escape it in some way. For a long time it is something external and by no means universal. It is only between the ages of 10 and 15 that understanding begins to approach that of an adult. I started reading Tolkien at the beginning of this period. As was common before the film adaptations, I started with The Hobbit, which Tolkien conceived as a story for his own children, which is clearly evident in the language of the work. The Lord of the Rings, on the other hand, is more likely to be considered an epic for adolescents. For the majority of readers, the journey ended here. Countless things could be criticized about Lord of the Rings. A fate mostly anchored in blood, an ideal of feudal socialism, Marx, old petty bourgeoisie and peasantry, nature worship and hostility to civilization as well as prudery. Certain points of criticism, as expressed by Daniel Sannon and Florian Ruttner, are therefore justified in principle. However, over long stretches they overshoot the mark, and not because of polemical exaggeration, but because of an almost discursive analysis of the work, which considers the discovery of buzzwords to be interpretation in itself. Rather, the strictly German reading of a very English script should be reflected upon. At best, Tolkien could be characterized as a representative and critic of English ideology, which is not written about as such for good reason. The short circuit between Wagner and Tolkien only works if you have no idea about either Tolkien or Wagner. Tolkien was a fierce opponent of Wagner's interpretation of the Nibelungs, with whom he shared certain sources, as well as of anti-Semitism, which is why Tolkien's dwarves are decidedly not caricatures of Jews, although they certainly represent them, and why the conservative Tolkien did not become a reactionary like Wagner. In contrast to Heidegger, for whom alienation could be reversed by going back to the historical origin, Tolkien simply lamented the loss, knowing that it was final for the time being. He even harbored a hot personal grudge against Hitler, as he himself put it. When he was asked to submit an Aryan certificate for a German translation, he wrote the following lines: "Unfortunately, it is not clear to me what you mean by Aryan. I am not of Aryan, namely Indo-Iranian descent, because as far as I know none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, the Gypsy language, or any of the related dialects. But if I may understand you to mean that you would like to know whether I am of Jewish descent, I can only reply that I regret that I apparently have no ancestors from this gifted people." End quote. Anyone who characterizes Gollum as a Jewish caricature but doesn't talk about Grendel from Beowulf or Caliban from Shakespeare's Tempest proves that he is imposing grandly powerful categories as foils on Tolkien from the outside without even comprehending the composition of the work itself, which is generally an intolerable form of criticism. Perhaps my early reading of The Lord of the Rings was a corrupt one, for I thought, and still think, that there is something that points beyond those things. For some reason I was quite indifferent to the Fellowship of the Ring, and the elves seemed to me to be the true bearers of the story, though they appear only as marginal characters in the two works. But every story, every memory at least hints at them. They formed the undertone, almost the myth in the mythical epic. The elves are ancient, even potentially immortal, and there was no sign of age on them, except in the depths of their eyes. According to the mortals, they resemble both kings and children, are old and young, sad and happy at the same time. Whether they made the land or the land made them is hard to say. In this sense, the elves are emblematic of a reconciliation of nature and man, which must encompass both the naturalization of man and the humanization of nature. Elves are not simply mere nature themselves, as Daniel Sannon puts it, but elevate nature. First and foremost, they represent beauty and, even more so, the sublime. It has been emphasized time and again that their voices and their singing are the most beautiful sounds to be heard in Middle-earth. The beauty of their faces also makes people shudder. At the same time, however, they stand for the reconciliation of past and present, because, for them, memory is more like the waking world than a dream. At the same time, they manage without any Heideggerian projections of a future, such as that represented by the Thousand-Year Reich as a collective design. Even at the beginning, it is cryptically stated that the elves left Middle-earth and took no more part in it, or that elven ships set sail, never to return. Later, it becomes increasingly clear that the success of the hobbits, i.e. the destruction of the One Ring, would mean that many beautiful things will fade and be forgotten. One elf goes on to say, "If you succeed, then our power will be diminished, and the elven kingdom will pass away and the floods of time will wash it away. We must move to the west." So although the heroic deed of the story seemed strictly necessary, my sympathy for its success was limited. A few hundred pages of adventure later, the wizard Gandalf finally proclaims, "The third age of the world has ended, the new age has begun. The time of the rule of men is coming, and the elder clan will fade or pass away." End quote. Although it is more or less a happy ending, there was no reconciliation for me. It was too clear that banality was now finally taking hold or gaining the upper hand, that the time of humans is our time, this eternal prehistory of humanity. It is only in the appendices, which are not included in many editions, that the full horror of death is revealed once again. Tolkien uses a very remarkable and questionable construction here. An immortal half-elf necessarily or automatically chooses mortality out of love for the mortal human king. But it was not her lot to die before all she had gained was lost. Her fellow species and relatives leave Middle-earth never to be seen again. When her extremely long-lived spouse finally realizes after 120 years of marriage that the time of payment is approaching, i.e. death, she experienced the bitterness of the mortality she had taken upon herself. Almost every defense of death refers to the torment of immortals and mortals, whether by Simone de Beauvoir, Tu les hommes sont mortels, or Nudcore with reference to Jonathan Swift. But this only means that the abolition of death must be as universal as death itself was before. For Tolkien, death had enormous significance. He lost his father at the age of 4 and was orphaned by the time he was 12. The death of his mother plunged him into a coma that lasted several days. All but one of his friends were killed in the First World War. He was unable to overcome his grief over the death of his wife and died 2 years after her. It was at this moment that she realized what she and her immortal people had not known about humans, whom she despised as wanton fools, and suddenly felt infinite pity for them. For if this is truly the gift of the one to men, as the elves say, then it is bitter to receive it. End quote. It was clear that this pity was also directed at me, especially since I didn't understand how death could be a gift. After all, it made everyone sad, and the phrase with which adults tried to console themselves in the case of the elderly, that someone had had a full life, was something I could never understand, especially as a child, because if that were the case or if everyone really believed it, they would hardly cry. It was rather clear to me that nobody had lived what could justifiably be called a fulfilled life, that I did not know and do not know what such a life would look like. And yes, it could be that such a life would be reconciled with death, but nobody knows that yet, and until then it remains a phrase for Sunday speeches or prophecy. At the same time, it became clear that people and everything they create is ugly beyond all measure, and why. As the dwarf Gimli put it, no matter what people do, in the end it's nothing more than smoke and mirrors. It is not about compulsively creating eternal works, but ones of the highest or even unknown quality and, above all, beauty. Since I now wanted to learn more about these beings and what left the world with them, I had to move on to the more encyclopedic part of the work, the Silmarillion, the books of lost stories and similar works that my parents had to provide me with if they didn't want to face the questions they themselves feared and to which they knew no answers. These works, along with a Cosmo and Theogony, are in fact the history of the elves. Tolkien made use of numerous regional myths, but above all northern, especially Celtic, myths. He himself detested the word Nordic, Catholic, Babylonian, as well as Greek and Finnish. The Celtic elements are generally the least well known, as Celtic mythology is extremely obscure, but they are the most significant for what is described here. Above all, the book Liber Gabala Iren, Book of the Conquest of Ireland, itself already Christo-Celtic, served Tolkien as inspiration for the elves, in particular the mythical pre-inhabitants of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann. Until the 17th century, this work was still regarded as real historiography. This seems to be characteristic of the Christianized paganism that is still significant today, especially in the Celtic regions of Great Britain, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, which could hardly be better expressed than by the answer of an Irishman, quoted in the epilogue of a volume of Irish fairy tales published in 1826, translated by the Brothers Grimm, who, when asked whether he believed in fairies, said, "I believe in God and the commandments, but the fairies are really there." I well remember having the impression at the time that Tolkien really had projected an adequate myth, or rather that one was being unraveled. The childish urge to explore took days and weeks. After all, it seemed to be about the mysteries of life. This was helped by the fact that the rest of Tolkien's work is quite fragmentary and often redundant, as his son actually had to reconstruct the myth from his father's countless notes. Furthermore, this part of the work consists of many poems, songs, and hymns. This was my first research into myth or history. The distinction between the two did not yet fully exist, but I was neither naive enough to think I could become an elf, nor to fail to realize that what I was researching had long since been irretrievably lost. The gradual exodus of the elves began long before the narrative time of The Lord of the Rings, but comes to its conclusion here. Even Tolkien was hardly interested in the time after that of the humans. It simply plays no role in his oeuvre. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien's actual main work, in which the shades of grey that are so lacking in his other works can also be found, the story of the War of the Ring comprises only a small subchapter of 20 pages. It should be noted, however, that the black and white painting that Tolkien is often criticized for is entirely in keeping with the narrative style of his sources. It quickly becomes clear that the elves at that time are already only a shadow of their former selves, more memory than reality. The few still wandering in Middle-earth are more an embodiment of nostalgia and depression, a shadow of themselves. In a sense, Tolkien immortalizes the transition from paganism to Christian monotheism in his work, as it appears as a subject in the saga of the Nibelungs or Beowulf. Thus, there is initially a creator god who creates the Vala, who are located somewhere between angels and the pagan elemental deities. He gives them a theme which they are to interpret and play musically. The world is ultimately created from this music. Elves and humans, on the other hand, are the two children of the one god. The elves are the first to awaken outside the realm of blessing inhabited by the gods and are led there by them. Some later flee from paradise and are cursed and banished due to the first acts of a biblical-like story of transgression, which they were seduced into committing by the fallen angel. The kingdom of blessing is part of the world, even if it is increasingly removed from it in the story. This in itself is a strong borrowing from the Celtic otherworld, especially Tir na Nog, land of eternal youth in the west of Ireland. Furthermore, the world, which was originally a disk, is later shaped into a sphere by the one god. They leave paradise for the freedom they long for and take with them the memories of the happiness from which they turned away. Elves can die due to two phenomena that occur mainly outside the realm of blessing: sorrow and violence. This is part of the divine curse. The elves are Germanic in name, but insular, Celtic in nature. Tolkien wrote large parts of his projections at the same time as Freud postulated the death instinct, in which I rediscovered Tolkien's projections as an adult. Elves do not die of old age and are not afflicted by disease. They live as long as the world exists, which indicates a certain finiteness. For them there is no heaven, only a strictly earthly life. Their bodies are vulnerable and potentially mortal. In the event that their body is destroyed or used up, their soul travels back to the blessed land and is reborn there. They return as souls to a hall that has nothing to do with Valhalla and everything to do with a sanatorium, where they heal and are reborn. The reincarnation of the elves is more of a resurrection, which should not happen too often due to their extreme longevity. Death is considered an external and extreme misfortune here. The physical rebirth is clearly an extension of the actual life. They slowly remember their former selves again. Life goes on and only begins anew to a limited extent. This is precisely why Tolkien had his elves impose a taboo on the wheel, after all one of the most important inventions of mankind, as it was a symbol of uniformity and repeatability. This taboo is clearly directed against the Far Eastern law of the wheel, Dharmakakra, which always stands for individual transience and celebrates the recurrence of the same thing and fatalism in the swastika, sun wheel, or similar motifs. Having failed to recognize this may have prompted Peter Jackson to equip the elves in the film adaptations with a heavy Far East kitsch, clothing, weapons, architecture. This taboo appears to be an ideological defense against the feared boredom often associated with immortality. The everyday use of the wheel was forbidden in ancient Tibet, for example, but here for the opposite reason, as this use would have profaned the sacred wheel. This is a consequent expression of Tibetan medieval feudal barbarism, which lasted until 1950 and which peace lovers are so fond of defending. Boredom in particular is regarded as another of Heidegger's major themes, which he attempts to grasp strictly in connection with the confused existential of temporality. Temporality is just as meaningless in relation to time as personality is in relation to the person. According to Heidegger, temporality is the essence of time, being in time, or rather being in time. Others simply call it transience or fleetingness. However, being and time breaks off precisely where time should really be considered. Heidegger writes, "Boredom arises from the temporality of existence, and, in being bored we are held back, and that by the hesitation of time." For him, the length of an empty time thus becomes the central characteristic or even essence of boredom, the experience of time. Sans phrase. Being bored is a peculiar paralyzing consternation by the hesitant passage of time and time in general. The German word for long while suits him very well here, as it shifts the focus from the state of boredom to its mere duration or the fear that it could linger long. For Heidegger, boredom is therefore also the ever-present basic trait of the human being, which can only be suppressed by existence, but only ends with death. However, the longer it lasts, the more unbearable it becomes for every mental state from which we suffer. The relationship of boredom to time is extremely secondary. Boredom, in the most general sense of simply being bored, is rather an expression of immaturity, which is particularly evident in so-called externally directed characters. Psychoanalytically, pathological boredom could be expressed as follows. The drive tension is there, the drive goal is missing. The outside world is supposed to provide this goal. It is about the transformation of activity into passivity due to a repression of childhood drive goals. One wants to be freed from attention through passive experience that arose because one is afraid of one's own active impulses. It is by no means surprising that boredom in puberty, together with sexuality, awakens anew and to an unprecedented extent. It is not that adolescents simply have nothing to do, but rather that what they want to do most urgently, i.e. have permanent sexual pleasure, is not permitted and no other activity can replace this impulse. The articulated fear that paradise is boring refers above all to the general damage to all people today, who would rather demand full employment than the abolition of work. Sandor Ferenczi explained these dispositions as Sunday neuroses, referring to those workaholics who can't stand it at the weekend or on vacation. These are often those anal characters who are stingy with their time. Boredom changes our sense of time and is not primarily the result of an altered sense of time itself. As if this had been suspected, the French ennui persisted in German for a long time, although Langweil had been known since the 12th century and the compound spelling since the 14th century. In older Austrian, on the other hand, there was the term Fidesz. In his concept of boredom, Heidegger already demonstrates the distortions that have to be made in order to provide arguments for death. Heidegger's aversion to immortality should also be viewed in this sense. As Davoli put it well, immortality is the inauthentic negation of actual mortality. The fear of boredom, however, refers to a time that must be expelled, and at the same time should be filled with meaning, as it is in short supply. Life that made sense did not ask for it, also means that life that had time would presumably not have to ponder it. And so, in a sense, the elves stand above or beside time. After the Fellowship of the Ring had spent some time in the elvish forest of Lorien, a hobbit who thought he had only spent 3 days there, when in fact the visit had lasted a month, wondered, it seemed to him as if we had spent no time at all in the elvish land, that time does not count there at all. This is another motif from the Celtic otherworld. This is a vivid reminder of a child's sense of time, for whom a year is half an eternity. A small child in particular begins to know about time at some point, but does not yet experience it and is certainly unable to reflect on it. The elf Legolas explains, time never lingers, but change and growth are not the same for all things and in all places. For the elves, the world moves, and it moves very quickly, and yet very slowly. Swiftly, because the elves themselves change little, while everything else hurries along. It is a sorrow to them. Slow, because they do not count the passing years, not for themselves. The passing seasons are but ever-repeating ripples on the long, long stream. End quote. There are hardly any adults who are not surprised that there are still living sequoia trees or pine trees that sprouted when Judaism was born, the Palace of Knossos was built and the stones of Stonehenge were erected, or ice sharks that can live to be 400 years old, which means that some specimens alive today were born at the beginning of the 30 Years' War. In a way, the conflict between the classical physical concepts of time is being played out here. On the one hand, Newton's absolute time and, on the other, Leibniz's relative time. This would be Newton's conception. Absolute, true, and mathematical time passes in itself and by its nature uniformly and without relation to any external object. Isaac Newton, Mathematical Principles of the Theory of Nature. Time is the order of that which does not exist at the same time. It is therefore the general order of changes, in which the particular nature of the changes is not seen. Leibniz, The Metaphysical Beginnings of Mathematics. The long stream of absolute time is simply a fact here, but it is only of limited relevance. According to Leibniz, time describes relationships between bodies and, above all, events. But this relativity is objective and not to be confused with the merely psychological perception of time. Against Hegel, who described time as the being of the subject itself, it should be insisted that time is always bound to the concrete temporal that takes place within it. Temporality is only the barbaric blending of both sides. The temporal is man as well as his environment. Time measures regularities of change. It is the relative size in relation to the speed of change. The elves suffer from time because of the transience of the environment in Middle-earth. It is not abstract time that is the problem, as some vulgar Marxists believe, but what happens within it: exploitation and wage labor. Redemption from time can only be achieved by revolutionizing the temporal, which means that time can only be practically changed in and by the temporal. Magic heals the wounds of time in Tolkien. In reality, man must do it himself. Immortality changes time qualitatively. The elves have no astronomical time calculation, or at least not primarily, but calculate in extremely long periods of time. Strictly speaking, we also have this with the week as the only non-astronomical calendrical concept of time, but this is explicitly short. An elvish year comprises 144 human or solar years and thus exceeds every single human age. It is also strictly arithmetical. Only in Middle-earth do they also have an astronomical calendar for the purpose of agriculture. This year is called the solar round. The elvish non-astronomical calendar is not to be confused with the lunar calendar of the Islamic calendar, which is the only lunar calendar that refuses to introduce leap days/months in order to constantly adapt to the solar calendar like all other lunar calendars, which is necessary for agriculture. Since the lunar year is even shorter, Muslims age faster, strictly speaking. By Christian reckoning, a 34-year-old Muslim would only be 33. The French revolutionary calendar, on the other hand, mainly changed the internal differentiation of the solar year, but was strictly based on the seasons and their tripartite division. Although the Gregorian calendar is considered to be more arithmetical, it attempts to perfect astronomical time measurement. The only truly arithmetic calendar would be the long count part of the Mayan calendar. The highest unit here is around 394 years. But the elves woke up under the stars. At that time, there was no moon and no sun. The sun was set as a sign of the awakening of men and the passing of the elves, while the moon preserves their memory. In the history of mankind, the sun was often depicted and worshipped as a chariot or will be at Helios in the chariot of the sun or the Germanic tribes. What Tolkien was able to grasp, however, was the connection between the emergence of solar calendars and the fear of one's own death, which no longer came from outside, as expressed in the death cults of ancient Egypt. In Tolkien, this appears in the sense that the counting of years according to the sun, which was enforced by humans, changed the world. They were more hasty and shorter than the long years in the blessed realm. The changing and aging of all things accelerated beyond measure. Time changed qualitatively in Tolkien's myth. The elves, however, drag their pre-sunset time calculation and the perception of time corresponding to it and their immortality with them and suffer from it. The radical thing about Tolkien's work is that he tackled almost all the representatives and symbols of the death instinct with the elves. We should not forget that, according to Freud, the unconscious knows no time, death, or sleep. It is questionable whether it knows about cold. In the unconscious, each of us is convinced of our immortality. So there is nothing instinctive in us that opposes the belief in death. If the unconscious knew sleep, that is, if it slept, we would simply not dream. There is no winter in the realm of blessing. Rather, there is always spring and autumn at the same time, a twilight. Elves also do not sleep in the human sense but only half-sleep or daydreams, and these can also take place with their eyes open. Magnus Clow has written some wonderful articles in which he defends winter or sleep against the social pretensions and ideological attacks to which these representatives and descendants of the death instinct are subject. The false idea of the abolition of death is exemplified very well by the false idea of the abolition of sleep, as reflected, for example, in the convulsive glorification of an equally convulsive night of speed consumption. You can sleep when you're dead, say only those who lead a life that hardly deserves the name. Those who think that as the fidgety undead, they are cheating death. Tolkien, on the other hand, projects a qualitative change in sleep in his elves. It too is still a retreat from the world, but here, or rather in the blessed realm, it is no longer so horrible that we have to close our eyes to it. Happy sleep, however, is the archetype not of death, but of reconciled nature. In sleep, individual life takes itself back into the living rest from which it can awaken again as an individual. Unfortunately, the German Tagtraum is conceptually closer to the conscious state and active realization than the French reverie. It is also important to insist that this slumber is by no means meditation. In Tolkien's conception of the blessed realm, twilight corresponds to the endless day there, bordered only by twilight hours, which is somewhat reminiscent of the polar day or the white nights and has nothing in common with the neo-illuminated night hours of today. The need for sleep, darkness, and winter in the here and now must be defended above all, as many descendants of the death instinct are not death itself, but elements of life and happiness. Freud himself expressed this by referring to the death instinct as the happiness instinct. It is not the death instinct that is to be fought, but only its escape into real death. the instinct named after him would be much more likely to be finally satisfied in life. The elves of Tolkien stand for this insofar as they are characterized by an enormous longing for the sea, which could easily be interpreted as a longing for death in modern humans. For the elves, however, it does not stand for death, but for the longed-for return to the earthly realm of blessing. It has already been mentioned above that Tolkien's work is characterized above all by blatant prudery. In the case of the elves, however, this is a concrete determination, not something that simply slipped in. The elves are apparently prudish because in later life, after a very long childhood and youth, they are subject to a complete sublimation of their libido. This idea can also be found in some of Houellebecq's works, where immortality is often linked to the sublimation of sexual urges. Thus, the androgyny of the elves is certainly a form of reaction to the presumed connection between death and bisexuality, August Weismann. Furthermore, elves hardly have any offspring, which may initially lead a British author to think that, in the spirit of Malthus, the overpopulation of the world, which would become more urgent if all humans were immortal, is being criticized here. What seems much more significant, however, is that it implicitly denounces the need or desire for offspring as by no means neutral, and thus suggests that there could be a state of humanity in which no one needs offspring in order to realize themselves, but in which no one would be denied offspring either. It should also be asked whether the mortality of humans since the Neolithic Revolution at the latest is not simply evolutionary waste. For of course it is not happiness to never be born, but it can be said with some certainty that never being born is of course less bad than dying. Anyone who thinks that the world would quickly become boring without new people is only unconsciously expressing the fact that they have long wished their own environment dead. This is an idea of interchangeability that must have been far removed from the elves, who bear unique names. I must also admit that I have repeatedly slipped into thinking of the elves as humans under communism. Should this also be the case here, I would like to make one or two excuses that do not serve to justify the content, but rather to make sense of these quite wrong thoughts, which are easy to make fun of. On the one hand, it shows how childhood impressions of happiness and beauty take root and are updated again. Distortions are also part of early reflections. Even as a child, it struck me that it was illogical for the elves to have kings and nobles, because their immortality and access to the world seemed difficult to reconcile with ruling over others. After all, they were all described as nobles. On the other hand, this power of projection stems from a well-known need. We only have the past, including the myths formed in it, to compare, to recognize what is still wrong today. This always includes recognizing the traces of happiness in the past, be it individual or human. It is inadmissible to turn this into a positive ideal type, but it undermines some. For Oscar Wilde, it was the Hellenes who were no longer to enslave people but finally machines, and even Marx had to be reproached by Wolfgang Port for having promised only the feudal lifestyle of a British landed gentry for all in one of his few colorations of communism. It should be noted, however, that in his theory of use value, Port himself deplored the demise of luxurious lifestyles of the aristocracy, which had nothing wrong with them but their restriction to a privileged few. If one recognizes such a projection as a projection, one has already half escaped the pathological part of thinking for the moment. In the case of the elves, the projective act is countered by the fact that they are not really tangible. They are mediated by the extremes of children and kings and not their leveling. Furthermore, the elves were the only ones who credibly represented the overcoming of death. This distinguishes them from the culture-industrial vampires, who only represent a mirror image and/or merely a duplicated image of what exists, which does not prevent ideological critics from discovering emancipatory potential in Buffy. It is always magic, in reality, also as magical thinking, one of the most urgent enemies of enlightenment, which as a literary subject, especially in children's books, can awaken the thought of a transcendent and the longing for the other without using God or demanding membership of a religion. Magic becomes a placeholder for a non-existent practice. The philosopher, Dominican and representative of Platonic utopianism, Tommaso expressed this connection as early as the 16th century as follows. Everything that scientists accomplish in imitation of nature or in order to help her with the help of an unknown art is called magic. For technology is always called magic before it is understood, and after a certain time it develops into a normal science. Thus, the magic of the elves stands blindly as the telos of a qualitative change in productive forces, such as a certain automation and the salvation of what utility value promised. Science fiction, on the other hand, paints this positively and thus betrays it. Fantasy literature also goes back to a time before the steam engine with almost unmistakable certainty. On the one hand, this expresses a flat and completely abstract hostility to industrialization. On the other hand, it is true that no technical achievement today can be absolutized and considered right. Even as a child, it was clear to me that immortality must change everything, that everything must change for it and in it. Immortality also stands for the fact that rigidity could release dynamism, instead of today's pseudo-dynamism, which results in social rigidity. Now the elves are not a utopian projection, but a negation of certain parts of man, for which Tolkien provides no positive corrective that would do justice to the elves. The hobbits are just a lazy compromise. Magic and rapture become symbols for the fact that something is missing. Tolkien's elves are not at all different from humans in the books because they have pointed ears, but at most an aura. Instead of man's alienation from an original, Tolkien sees them as one of his potentials, ideals. The humans created by Tolkien should have a power to live their lives in the midst of all the powers and accidents of the world according to their own choice. But with this gift, it is one that the children of men dwell only for a short time in the living world and are not bound to it, but soon depart. They were called guests or strangers by the elves. Later it is truthfully said, death is their fate. This vacillation in the contemplation of death between gift and fate runs throughout Tolkien's work. Grief in the face of death is given a great deal of space. In The First Men, the elves experienced for the first time the swift extinction of human life and death from weariness, which they themselves did not know, and they mourned greatly for the loss of their friends. The elves, however, remain to the end of all days. Therefore their love of the earth and of all things is more particular. It is stronger and, as the years grow longer, more weighed down with sorrow. End quote. For Tolkien, human freedom, which includes human mastery of nature, and this also in its destructive potential, is therefore connected with the fact that people can leave the world in their death and thus maintain an external relationship with it. From the phrase that we are only guests on earth, environmental protection and nature conservation, as well as the idea that we have only borrowed the earth from our children, could only be derived if anyone still knew what the right of hospitality means. At the same time, as with Hegel, death appears here as a return to the species, which also occurs almost one-to-one with the anti-Hegelian Schopenhauer. Being only a guest also allows the saying, "After me, the deluge," according to Marx, the rallying cry of every capitalist and every capitalist nation. MEW 23, page 285. The idea of overcoming death is aimed precisely at and against this "after me." In Tolkien's work, no one but the one God knows what happens to people after their death, but it is clear that they leave the earth, not just Middle-earth. It remains unclear whether there is a heaven or an eternal life for them. All that remains for them is trusting faith to alleviate the fear of death so as not to despair of it. In fact, there are repeated hints that people can be reconciled with death. Some people have willingly given up their lives and gone in peace, which is cited as exemplary behavior. At the same time, however, no one, whether humans, elves, or the elemental gods, believes that death should seriously be regarded as a gift, a theme that runs through the entire work. On the other hand, Tolkien unfolds the excesses that result from man's attempted defense against death. The fear of death is based on a seduction by evil, such as Sauron, and death can be something good if it is viewed differently. At the same time, it comes through again and again that this seduction meets an existing need. Some human elven friends, the Numenor, were granted to live on an island within sight of the Blessed Realm, which they were never allowed to enter. They lived much longer and knew no disease, but they had to die of old age at some point, even if they lived to be a few hundred years old. Their increasing efforts to escape death led to mummification, the cult of the dead, and eventually to human sacrifice. Ultimately, their arrogance towards the gods, they tried to take over the kingdom of blessings in the hope of achieving immortality, because they failed to realize that the immortal inhabitants blessed the land and not the other way around, ended in their destruction by a flood and the rapture of the kingdom of blessings from the sight of mankind. The memory of what could have been was lost. Only the two elven places, Rivendell and Lorien, were still reminders of all that had been noble. Although repeatedly claimed, there is no passage in which the immortals seriously envy the humans their mortality. The elves eventually move out of Middle-earth. Humans, on the other hand, have to suppress and forget the immortals and thus the thought of earthly immortality in order to come to terms with their finite existence more badly than well, i.e. to no longer be tempted to cross the boundary that was set for their happiness. This, however, would be a challenge for mankind. History could teach us how not to do it. Tolkien was neither a great critic nor a great writer, but it occurred to me early on that no criticism should fall short of his lament, which he may not have intended at all, but which is nevertheless extremely present. But it was only with Freud and, above all, Adorno and Houellebecq that I came across this idea again, albeit in a different form. The fact that The Lord of the Rings, like the rest of Tolkien's work, is probably lost for good is evident not only from the film adaptations, but also from the more recent book covers. It has been completely swallowed up by the fantasy genre he created. The difference is this: Tolkien studied the myths, his successors studied Tolkien. They extended all the moments that carried a mark of damage without doing justice to those, sometimes very marginal ones, that pointed beyond it. Anyone who defends Game of Thrones fails to recognize this. The entire genre moved almost completely into positivism immediately after Tolkien. This is particularly evident in the successful Harry Potter cycle, in which the desire to abolish death is branded as radical evil. But even Tolkien could be used to show what Horkheimer expressed in his later days, namely, that the true conservative is more akin to the true revolutionary than to the fascist, just as the true revolutionary is more akin to the true conservative than to the so-called communist today. What unites the true conservative with the true revolutionary is probably above all traces and impressions from childhood, often coincidental, but above all difficult to reconstruct. Just as hidden as these impressions are often the ways in which one came to them. I think that there are books that you can or must only have read at a certain age, in this case as a child, which does not mean that you have to have read them at all, but only that if you only try to read them as an adult, you will no longer find certain things in them. For my part, I probably learned from Tolkien that everything could and must be different, that death or mortality cannot be seen as the essence of life, which only gives it value by limiting it. This seems to me to be a realization, in my case from childhood, that is all too quickly buried under later depressive longings for death. Today, turning night into day is more of a threat than a promise. The cheerful hedonism with which the slogan flirts only half-heartedly masks the resignation that underlies it. Where everyone gets on each other's nerves from dawn to dusk with furious good humor and hopeless optimism. The night, if it is allowed to take place at all, is no longer a time of dreams and mystery, but at most of permitted exhaustion. The repulsive ideal of the good citizen who goes to work in the morning, cheerful and ready to perform, only to sink contentedly into a dreamless sleep in the evening after the day's work is done, exists only as a caricature of a staid past. Since there are hardly any citizens left who can rely on the regularity of their work as much as on their wife's unexpected goodnight kiss, everyone has become a prospective ego worker and has to mediate between the work and rest phases of their life, which has degenerated into a project, just as creatively as between relationship and career. The offhand question of who you can crash at these days, by which habitual students and leisure leftists tend to recognize each other, is not evidence of a sympathetic lack of need and spontaneity, but of a completed adaptation to a world in which people are literally depriving themselves of sleep. Sleeping is sleeping in poverty and lack of freedom, nothing but the hapless execution of a natural compulsion, not a gift that one accepts, but a meager fate to which one resigns oneself. But the intimate concentration of the happy sleeper, who is lost to the world and yet completely with himself, exists in the consciousness of most people only as a memory of a childhood that we do not even know we ever had. The history of sleep is inseparable from the history of the electrification of the night. In the mixture of panic and enthusiasm described by the early urban literati and feuilletonists, with which city dwellers reacted to the transformation of nocturnal life through neon signs and advertising, there was a glimpse of the unresolved natural history of mankind. Man's ability to turn night into day, achieved through advanced mastery of nature, is the condition of all urbanity and heralded the triumph of cities over the countryside. Only in their artificial light did the objective darkness of the countryside come to light, where the course of human life never fully emancipated itself from the position of the sun. But it was only the nocturnal light and the wild noise of the cities that made it possible to experience the beauty and living silence of the natural night, which is not only nature, but must first be recognized as such by the social being that is man. By freeing the separation between the two spheres from the relentless monotony of the natural cycle, the ability to turn night into day has also humanized sleep. Since then, It is no longer something that humans merely have in common with the animals that wake them up, like the farmer waking up to a crowing cock, but the most intimate thing they can share. By inventing rooms, clothes, songs, stories, and rituals dedicated solely to sleep and individualizing the transition from day to night, they have transformed sleep from a blind natural constraint into a gift that everyone can give to themselves and others. Since then, sleep has not simply been something that everyone has to do, but an experience that each individual cannot lose. However, just as technology is never just a means to a specific end, but becomes a blind necessity for individuals powerlessly carrying out their social destiny, so too artificial light has become natural, and everyone is now under its spell. Perhaps light and electricity are the most cogent examples of the transformation of nature-dominating technology into an impenetrable second nature. The panicked euphoria of city dwellers in the face of the electrification of the night also expressed the fear of this realization. The impenetrable darkness at the end of each day, which yields no returns in terms of useful work and yet seems unavoidable, reminds us, like sleep, of the unmastered first nature. Total socialization manifests itself not only in some kind of social systems, as sociology, which degrades itself to a pseudonatural science, tends to call them, but in the very concrete transformation of the body into the body, sedimented in individual experience, from which every memory of the fact that man as a social being is also a natural being is supposed to be erased. In happy sleep, however, the body comes to itself as the body, as which it asserts itself in the tiredness, exhaustion, the appearance of failure vis-a-vis the apparent self-identity of the waking subject. Complete insomnia, inaccessible to treatment, invariably leads to death. What is split off from the normality of social life as a rare, temporarily untreatable illness and handed over to the doctors is a negative indication that the need for the total socialization of sleep itself is intertwined with the death instinct. Happy sleep, however, is the archetype not of death, but of reconciled nature. In sleep, individual life takes itself back into the living rest from which it can awaken again as an individual. However, the ever more comprehensive departmentalization of life, the fragmentation of day and night into various phases of work, leisure, relationships, and rest, which has long since made the emphatic idea of an individual profession just as illusory as that of an individual life that is not aimlessly wasting away, also exercises the possibility of such an awakening along with happy sleep. In this way, the ability of civilization to turn night into day has itself become an anti-civilization technique. Because people despise the night as the meager remnant that they themselves have made it into, they drown out its living silence with noise and illuminate its blackness until it has become as dull as the glare of everyday life. Sleep, meanwhile, because it unfortunately still cannot be completely dispensed with, must be content with the dead time that meaningless life leaves it. This is why so-called sleep medicine now deals almost exclusively with sleep techniques and sleep disorders, sleep stages and REM phases, records brain waves and classifies insomnia symptoms. For them, sleep is not a manifestation of human natural history that can be understood as a historical phenomenon, but a crude natural phenomenon that can be controlled scientifically, mere material for social and individual conditioning, just like people themselves. Her most popular psychological categories are stress and energy. She knows as little about sex as she does about the unconscious. She interprets sleep disorders not as an indication of an unresolved contradiction between body and body, psychic and somatic, but solely as an indication that total integration has still not been completely successful, that the individual person is still not one with the social person, to whose identity he is supposed to be sworn not only at work, in love and in everyday life, but also in dreams, which he is supposed to endure with closed eyes and sealed senses just as mercilessly against himself as his whole life. In sleep research, stress and energy are not qualitative terms meaning something to be eliminated or released, but rather quantitative terms whose ratio should be optimally regulated. This is why power napping, also affectionately known as a power nap, has become a tried and tested self-technology in humane workplaces with flat hierarchies, as known to various cultural and creative professionals. Progressive companies and progressive office communities are proud of their in-house relaxation rooms with individual relaxation music. 10 to 30 minutes is enough for those who have long since lost their cool at night to be able to devote themselves to their work with somnambulistic enthusiasm. What the coffee to go is for the senselessly agile city dweller, the power nap is for the happily stupefied freelancer. The problem is integrating rest periods into the working day. We have to get away from the time clock mentality, says Jürgen Zulli, head of the Sleep Medicine Center at the University of Regensburg, whose professional title already reveals that all people are potential patients for him. The truth of the matter is that sleep today does indeed appear to society to be the disorder that sleep doctors supposedly want to cure. Individuals themselves perceive it as an archaic relic of which self-aware contemporary people must be ashamed, like love, delight, or grief. The face of the happy sleeper, however, is the archetype of nonviolence and defenselessness without fear. In it, life takes back its blind rawness in the name of eternal peace, which would be nothing other than life itself liberated from the constraints of nature. That is why the unmistakable physiognomy of the individual human being, which he is not in everyday life, shines through in the face of the sleeping person alone, who seems to have fallen out of the world. That is why the night is not only the time of sleep, but also of love, which, like happy sleep, fears the glaring light of the bad world. In the lines of the nightingale and the lark, which express the anxious harmony of love and sleep in unrepeatable beauty, there is a flash of recognition that the day, which destroys happiness and has not ceased to begin again and again since then, is not the real day to which humanity must first awaken. Just as the despisers of sacred beauty discover a perverse fantasy behind every image of a saint, the despisers of snow see in it nothing but the dirt that remains after it has disappeared. What a mess it will be once it has melted. Even if the beach hasn't been under the pavement for a long time, there is certainly shit under the snow, which is swept under the carpet of cleanliness during the festive season. The convinced enemy of snow believes that we should feel its stench in our noses every day and see it steaming on every corner. But the snow, this silent mythologist, suddenly covers it up overnight as if it had never been. How much more honest is the summer, which really brings out every fresh dog turd and unfolds every last vapor in 1,000 nuances. Summer drags everything out into the open. What stinks, stinks worse than ever. Nothing ugly can be ignored and the streets are besieged by noisy mobs. Winter, on the other hand, forces even notorious fans of permanent urban camping to live for a while instead of loitering, and imposes a silence on the world that can't be shattered by a beer bottle smashed at 2:30 in the morning. The contours become softer, the days shorter and the people friendlier, as if they had discovered their discarded good manners on the suspended floor alongside their winter wardrobe. It's all too good to be true, and by New Year's Eve at the latest, snow haters and winter haters will prove otherwise. This most joyless of all festivals seems to have been devised solely to revoke Christmas. The Christian holiday is followed by pagan regression like the belching of communion. The evil spirits are driven out because all the good ones have been abandoned, and the collective exorcism transforms family fathers into guerrilla fighters. The day after, there is that leaden silence that people have always preferred to the gentle one, and then it doesn't take too long before entire districts are transformed into barbecue areas and whole meadows into burnt wastelands. It's finally time to live again. In summer, writes Walter Benjamin, the fat people stand out, in winter the thin ones. This points to the connection between clothing and shame. In summer, people have to expose themselves and show the world how they really are. Nature itself forces them to do so, and anyone who still dresses like it's spring in midsummer has only themselves to blame. However, this compulsion does not emphasize equality but inequality. In summer, those who are fat, old, or pale feel discriminated against by nature itself, as it were, which makes the beautiful and fit right and everyone else wrong. In winter, nature forces people to take back their nature. They wrap themselves up, hide the facticity of their bodies under countless layers of clothing, and thus create an equality that, precisely because it is not natural, corresponds to their nature as the equality of all that is human. This is why thin people stand out differently in winter than fat people in summer. Not as what they are, but as it were as what they are not. Not through the space that their bodies occupy, but through the space that their clothing occupies between them and the cold from which it protects them. To stand out in summer is exposing or vain. In winter it is concealing and discreet, a balancing justice. Contrary to what the critics of snow romanticism suggest, snow has always caused people fear rather than pleasure. The snowy landscapes of romantic painting are all manifestations of a sublime that has lost the moment of self-exaltation, in which the subject asserts its power over that which simultaneously threatens it. Snow is the force of nature in which nature negates itself by turning into the inorganic. Not a raging sea that could be heroically conquered by the subject in the act of visualization, but a rigid, cold surface that stretches into infinity. It is not its dynamism but its static nature that frightens. Lifeless and immobile, it constantly multiplies and seems to render all boundaries unrecognizable, to transcend all horizons. The sea is the untamed life that can become dangerous to the tamed. The snow is the constantly self-perpetuating death. In Biedermeier literature, which many people wrongly regard as a bourgeois decaying form of romantic literature, snow takes on the same demonic quality that was previously inherent in water, for example in the Undine motif. In Adalbert Stifter's stories, which should not be missing from any compendium of horror literature, snow figures as the final extinction of any ability to orientate oneself, as blindness, dumbness and deafness at the same time, as the death of any sensuality, which is at the same time longed for as a frenzy in which the particular ego perishes forever. However, it is a frenzy in which death is present in a different way than in the motif of water. It is not the return to any uterine origins that is imagined as a redeeming self-extinction, but the self-negation of nature and its living movement. For this reason, the more modern literature erases the traditional metaphor of nature, the more snow and crystal become ciphers of individuation. As congealed, self-contained nature that preserves itself in this very way, the crystal embodies in itself what mere nature is incapable of redeeming. People who disappear in the snow come to themselves by being lost to the world. The snow stands, perhaps for the first time in Schubert's Winterreise, for a form of rupture between the self and the world that can no longer be reconciled. The wanderer in the snow follows a path on which he is accompanied by no one, which leads to no one and literally to nothing, but which for this very reason appears as a path of individuation in a world in which coming to oneself must mean losing the world. The all-round glorification of summer, in which life is finally allowed to unfold to its heart's content, and the hatred of the season in which nature freezes and freezes, testifies to the secret awareness of the constant threat that a beautiful life could only be had at the price of killing oneself, individuation only at the price of losing the world. The death portrait of Robert Walser, who voluntarily spent the last years of his life in a mental hospital, shows him collapsed on a walk in the middle of a snowy landscape. The entire effort of his literature was devoted to the attempt to find a language of kindness in full awareness of the omnipresent fear, which preserves a trace of everything that is betrayed on a daily basis. His death was not a tragic end, but an accident. Nevertheless, his last picture seems to summarize his life. If there are summer people and winter people, then he was a winter person like most modern authors. Perhaps even like everyone who suspects the truth behind the insistent praise of sun, air and joie de vivre.